Hey, what's up, Apish kids? We're back for our next lecture here in AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topics 6.2 and 6.3, Western Expansion. Our learning objectives today are exactly the same. They are 6B and 6C, explain the causes and effects of the settlement of the West from 1877 to 1898. We've got several key ideas today that we're going to be looking at, so it's important to go ahead and focus on those. So our first key idea says, in hopes of achieving ideals of self-sufficiency and independence, migrants moved to both rural and boomtown areas of the West for opportunities, such as building the railroad, mining, farming, and ranching. Now, this entire time period is going to be an era between 1865 and 1898, where the West is going to be settled. We can see how in the charts and the maps there on our screen, we can see the land use areas of the United States in 1860, the year that the Civil War is going to start, to 1880, in the map at the bottom, how there's going to be an increasing amount of land use that's going to happen in the western areas. And from the chart, we can see that land that is not being farmed in 1850 represents 84%, where we see by 1900, farmland is going to increase nearly threefold, so nearly half of all land in the West being farmed. Now, in terms of what's bringing people out here, the first thing that's going to start to really attract lots of settlers to the West is the mining industry, especially after the Civil War. Now, before the Civil War, it had been this mining industry that had brought many people to California. As part of what we know as the Gold Rush, which started in 1849 and continued into the 1850s. And this movement west to find gold and other precious metals such as copper, lead, silver, zinc, etc. are going to continue even after the war. You can see a picture of some of those miners at their craft in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, some miners are going to find huge discoveries of both gold and silver, such as in Leadville, Colorado. Silver is going to be discovered in massive quantities. We see the giant stack of silver bricks as stacked as high as a man. This was known as the Comstock lode. In 1880, they had extracted $270 million in gold and $400 million worth of silver from that Comstock lode in Nevada. Now, mining towns had helped to develop the West because each town created a need for businesses as well as for government. And this would bring in even more people to support those other local industries. Now, the second industry that's going to bring many people to the West is the cattle boom. After the Civil War, demand for beef led to a cattle boom in the West. Ranchers will mostly use what's called the long drive and the open range to railroad towns further to the north. We can see examples of those cattle drives in the picture on this screen. Now, cattle was incredibly profitable. Cattle bought for $4 in Texas were oftentimes driven as much as 3 months across what was called the open range, and to places such as Kansas City, Cheyenne, Omaha, Sioux City, when they would be sold in these western cattle towns, for instance, like Dodge City, for as much as $40. And then from there, placed upon cattle cars and shipped to meatpacking plants in cities like Chicago. These cattle drives led to new towns in the West along those railroad routes. However, this time period of these long drives and the cattle ranchers and the cowboys that necessitated these long drives didn't last for very long. It really only lasted for about 10 to 15 years in U.S. history. By the 1880s, they were facing lots of difficulties. The open range was closing as farmers used new barbed wire fencing to close off their farms, and overgrazing and drought had left little grassland for the grazing cattle. By 1900, the glory days of the cowboy were completely over, and the era of the open range had ended. The third thing that's going to bring people to the West is going to be farming. And the majority of migrants into the West were farmers. Now, this push westward really began during the Civil War. In 1862, Congress is going to pass one of the most significant laws, in my estimation, in history, and that's the passage of the Homestead Act. Now, what this does is the Homestead Act gave 160 acres of land free to anyone who promised to farm the land and what we call improve the land for 5 years. Now, hundreds of thousands of migrants are going to move onto the Great Plains to gain this free farmland. And we can see an example of one of the homestead certificates right here. You can see in the middle of the page how 160 acres is being provided to this particular person. But life on these 160 acres wasn't exactly easy. And oftentimes the acreage that was doled out as part of the Homestead Act was not always the best. Homestead life was very difficult on the Great Plains. Farming was difficult for a variety of reasons. But homesteaders learned new techniques such as dry farming and planting new varieties of crops in the West. And homes and houses also had to be adapted to the new environment. For instance, homesteaders built what were called sod houses or soddies because of the lack of trees on the Great Plains. We can see some examples of those on the picture on the right-hand side. If you'll notice, if you look at the construction of some of those houses, it almost looks like bricks. But in fact, what they've done is they've cut out sections of the sod to build as the walls of their house. Just like if you've ever seen someone getting a new lawn put in with strips of sod, they've used these strips of sod as the foundation for their sides of their homes. They were usually incredibly leaky and bug-filled, and usually dug about halfway into the ground to make them a little bit cooler during the summer months. Now, tornadoes and droughts were often a constant problem for the people that lived out here, as well as brush fires as well. And although they got the land for free, most of them didn't make it. 60% of homesteaders failed to make it the required 5 years and had to leave their homesteads. However, those that succeeded transformed America into a food exporter for the world. Now, in addition to the homesteaders that were moving west, other farmers and other groups of people also attempted to escape to the west for a new life. Many African Americans, who were known as exodusters, took advantage of the Homestead Act to escape the Jim Crow South. We can see examples of these different exodusters and by the ferry load being moved to the west. Now, many of them and many African Americans in the South were not able to escape the West. Remember, many of them are stuck in a cycle of poverty in the South. But those that could attempted to make a new life on the Western Plains. However, most African Americans did stay in the South at the time. Now, the final cause of Western migration was the development of the railroads. Miners, ranchers, and farmers were connected to eastern cities in 1869 with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this and other transcontinental railroads later on were incredibly important for the economic development of the West. Without the Transcontinental Railroad, making money as a farmer on the western frontier was not possible. And the federal government was highly influential in creating this Transcontinental Railroad. They encouraged the railroad construction by giving millions of acres of land to railroad companies. What they would do is that the federal government, and the way that they would do this, is they would provide the land free of charge to the railroad companies, rather than paying the railroad companies specifically to build the railroad. And then what the railroad company could do is, as they built the railroad, they could then sell the land adjacent right next to the railroad. And this land, because it was right next to the railroad, suddenly became much more valuable. And it was from these land sales then that the railroad companies could then finance further construction of those particular railroads. Now, the first Transcontinental Railroad, certainly the most famous, was built mostly by immigrant workers. In part, this is because they worked and were much cheaper to employ than American workers themselves. Now, there were two major companies that built the first Transcontinental Railroad. The first one was called the Union Pacific, and it worked from Omaha, Nebraska, and would eventually end at Promontory Point, Utah. and it was built from east to west mostly by Irish workers. Now, working the other way was the Central Pacific, and it started in Sacramento and then met up at Promontory Point, mostly built by Chinese workers during this particular time. Now, famously, they met on May 10th, 1869 at Promontory Point, Utah, and completed the first transcontinental railroad. Now, over the next 21 years, an additional 5 railroads would be completed that connected the east to the Pacific coast. Now, the creation of railroads also had other important innovations as well. One of the major innovations was the creation of time zones to coordinate train schedules. Those time zones are still in effect today, though if you look closely at the map, those particular time zones have certainly been adjusted in more modern times. In addition to this, new luxury trains called the Pullman Palace cars, as well as refrigerated train cars to be able to transport things such as beef, poultry, eggs, butter, fruit, and even ice, were churning across America on its new rail lines. Now, the migration of Americans into the West had left no unorganized territories by 1890. And the Western frontier, this idea that there was a line somewhere across the United States where there was a space beyond that, where there was nothing, had disappeared. The entire West had essentially been settled, and the Western frontier had been closed by 1890. Now, this inspired an American historian named Frederick Jackson Turner to write a paper, or a very famous paper, called his Frontier Thesis in 1890. Now, he writes this influential essay called The Significance of the Frontier in American History in 1893. Now, he's going to argue that for 300 years of frontier experience had shaped American culture by promoting independence and individualism. He also argued that the frontier was a powerful social leveler, breaking down class distinctions and thus fostering social and political democracy. Now, the closing of the frontier troubled Turner. He saw the availability of free land on the frontier as a safety valve for harmlessly releasing discontent in American society. The frontier had always held out the promise of a fresh start. Once the frontier was gone, would the United States be condemned to follow the patterns of class division and social conflict that had troubled Europe, he posited? Well, many debate the Turner thesis. Historians acknowledge that by the 1890s, the largest movement of Americans was to the cities and industrialized areas. Not only was the area of the western frontier coming to a close, but the dominance of rural America was also in decline. Now, a new round of conflicts in the West began in the 1870s. The Indian Appropriation Act of 1871 is going to end the recognition of tribes as independent nations by the federal government and nullify previous treaties made by the tribes. In addition to this, conflicts will also happen with workers who had helped to construct those particular railroads, the transcontinental railroads, moving west. And this happened mostly with Chinese workers. Now, Chinese workers had first been recruited to America to help build the railroad. But in a wave of nativism that had spread in the United States as concerns that Chinese workers were taking American jobs, Congress is going to pass what is called the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which will end Chinese immigration to the United States. Another unfortunate example of nativism in the United States. A reoccurring theme that we've looked at in our last unit, which with the passage and the creation of the Know Nothing or the American Party, and will also continue into our next several units as well. Bringing us then to key idea number 2. As migrant populations increased in number and the American bison population was decimated, competition for land and resources in the West among white settlers, American Indians, and Mexican Americans led to an increase in violent conflict. Now, the Gilded Age is also going to bring devastation to the Native Americans. By the end of the Civil War in 1865, 2/3 of all American Indians lived on the Great Plains. Plains Indians included groups like the Sioux, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, and they were dependent upon the buffalo as well as the horse. As we can see here, they're using the buffalo for just about all of their tools in life and clothing. Now, as we've already learned, Jackson used the Indian Removal Act to remove Native Americans during his administration from east of the Mississippi River. And he's going to create what's called Indian country, as you see in this red area on the map. And it was located on the plains and was protected by several treaties from white settlers. Now, Manifest Destiny is going to give the U.S. more territory in the West. And as a result, Indians are going to be concentrated onto smaller and smaller tracts of land. Now, the flood of miners, ranchers, farmers during this Gilded Age is going to violate an Indian territory, and this is going to lead to a series of conflicts known as the Indian Wars. For instance, in 1864, Colorado militia will attack and murder Cheyenne Indians, mostly women and children, in what's known as the Sand Creek Massacre. That's on the little green dot that you see there. However, what most people realized was that the most efficient way to defeat Native Americans was not through open warfare, but was by killing off the buffalo. Hunters killed buffalo for their hides, which were often sold in the East or taken as prizes, or just shot for the fun of it, and their carcasses left to rot. The U.S. government, as well as railroad companies, had hired hunters to specifically kill buffalo. The buffalo herds were a menace to trains as they crossed across the continent on the newly constructed transcontinental railroads. A good hunter could kill 100 buffalo in a day, and buffalo hunters in the West killed as many as 3 million per year. We can see literally the stacks of buffalo hides in this on the picture on the bottom right-hand side. And we can see in 1800 there's 65 million American bison, but by 1870 there's only about 1,000 left. By the end of the Gilded Age, only 1,000 remained. And if we look at just the devastation in the picture that you see there, that is a mountain of buffalo skulls. It was a truly tragic event. Leading us to key idea number 3. The U.S. government violated treaties with American Indians and responded to resistance with military force, eventually confining American Indians to reservations and denying tribal sovereignty. Now, in 1851 and then reaffirmed in 1868, the Sioux Indians had signed what was called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Now, this treaty was designed to bring peace between whites and the Sioux Indians, who agreed to settle within the Black Hills Reservation in the Dakota Territory, which you can see on the map on the left-hand side. And the Sioux were promised that these Black Hills would be theirs for, quote, as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers will flow. However, in the 1870s, Americans once again flooded into Sioux territory in South Dakota when gold was discovered in the Black Hills. The Sioux, led by their leader Sitting Bull, pictured there, retaliated by ambushing Colonel Custer and all 197 of his soldiers in the 7th Cavalry at the Battle of Little Bighorn, killing all of them. However, this was just one victory in a series of defeats for Native Americans on the Western Plains. The last Indian battle in U.S. history was fought at Wounded Knee in 1890. The U.S. Army attacked the Sioux after tribal leaders had refused to stop what was known as the ghost dances. At Wounded Knee, 200 men, women, and children were killed, and Indians never fought the U.S. again in open battle. With the buffalo all but exterminated and the frontier closed by white settlers, the Indian Wars ended in 1890. And by 1890, Indians were restricted to small reservations in isolated locations. Leading us finally to key idea number 4. Many American Indians preserved their cultures and tribal identities despite government policies promoting assimilation, and they attempted to develop self-sustaining economic practices. Now, the U.S. government had attempted to assimilate Native Americans and to make them more American and less Native American. And they attempted to take away their native culture through assimilation. We can see some of the examples of that by attempting to change the way they dressed, their customs for marriage, and even their education. The most famous attempt was the Carlisle Indian School, as reformers advocated formal education, job training, and conversion to Christianity. They set up boarding schools such as the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania to segregate American Indian children from their people and teach them white culture and farming and industrial skills. Their motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man." And this new phase in the relationship between the U.S. government and American Indians was incorporated in the Dawes Act of 1887. The act was designed to break up tribal organizations, which many felt kept American Indians from becoming civilized and law-abiding citizens. The Dawes Act divided the tribal lands into plots of up to 160 acres, depending on family size. Now, U.S. citizenship was granted to those who stayed on the land for 25 years and adapted the habits of civilized life. Now, the new policy proved a failure. By the turn of the century, disease and poverty had reduced the American Indian population to just 200,000 persons, most of whom lived as wards of the federal government. Now, the injustices done to American Indians were chronicled in a best-selling book by Helen Hunt Jackson called A Century of Dishonor, published in 1881, and then republished in 1888. Although this book created sympathy for American Indians, especially in the eastern United States, it also generated support for ending Indian culture through assimilation. So in conclusion today, we've talked about the different reasons for people moving on to the West, including mining, ranching, and farming, and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. We've also talked about the effects of that movement west and how Native Americans were displaced from their traditional homes, had treaties violated, fought, and failed, and eventually led to attempts at assimilation of Native Americans on the western frontier. Well, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and until next time, go Pack!